All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Claire. I'm the event coordinator for Village Books in Bellingham and Linden, Washington, and we are delighted that you could join us tonight. A couple of things about Crowdcast, if you have not ever been on a Crowdcast event before. Some things to think about. If you're hearing any kind of feedback or echo, what you might do is consider turning down the volume of your computer. You can make sure you only have one window open in your browser, just one Crowdcast window open. And then if that doesn't work, go ahead and put on some headphones, and that should take care of audio issues that you are having. I want to thank those of you who made contributions at registration to our event programming. We really do appreciate it during this extremely challenging time. And to those of you who purchased books at registration, thank you so much. If you did that recently, rest assured your books are on their way. I'm shipping them out tomorrow. So thank you so much for doing that. And for those of you who took advantage of the free tickets, we appreciate that too. We're so glad that we can still offer the free programming that everybody expects and is used to here at Village Books. So we have a lot of, speaking of those events, we have a lot of great events coming up, and I want to let you know about tomorrow's event. That's Friday, March 19th at 6 p.m. We are going to welcome the editor and two contributors of this book, Whiteness is Not an Ancestor, Essays on Life and Lineage by White Women. That's tomorrow at 6 p.m. So if you want more information about that, you can go to villagebooks.com, and on our event page, you'll see it right there. I encourage you to check it out. That's going to be a very interesting conversation. If during the course of the event you have any questions that pop into your mind for our author, I encourage you to, if you look at the bottom of the screen, it says ask a question. I encourage you to open that up, pop your question in there, and then we're just going to collect the questions so that we can get to them during the Q&A portion. It's a little easier to see those questions when they're in the ask a question feature rather than putting them in the chat, because how they like to cycle up during the chat. So we are going to keep the chat enabled this evening, but I do encourage you, again, to please use the Ask a Question feature that you see at the bottom of your screen. I do want to state, because we are keeping the chat open and the Ask a Question feature open tonight, I want to state that this virtual readings gallery is a safe space. Any user exhibiting offensive, hateful, or inappropriate behavior will be dismissed from the event immediately. And then also an important button right there, center screen below me, the green button that says Purchase Emily St. John Mandel's books here. If you click on that green button, it takes you straight to the Village Books website, the page where it has all of our authors' books listed this evening. So probably many people in the audience tonight have read Station 11. Probably, possibly, a good number of you have read the featured title this evening, but there are other titles there by the author this evening. So if you want to see all of them there listed, conveniently located on one page for your purchasing, please feel free to click through and support the author and an independent bookstore in doing so. It's through book sales that we are able to provide such robust event programming. So we encourage you to consider it. So thank you. All right, so let's get started. Our moderator this evening is one of the newer members of the Village Books family. Emily Thompson is a student at Western Washington University here in Bellingham, and as a bookseller, she loves finding the perfect novel for customers, and she loves encouraging kids to read. And now to introduce our featured author this evening, Emily St. John Mandel's 5 novels include The Glass Hotel and Station 11, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and the PEN/Faulkner Award and has been translated into 32 languages. She's joining us from New York City this evening, where she lives with her husband and her daughter. She's here to talk about her latest book, newly to paperback, The Glass Hotel. So please join me in welcoming the two Emilys, Emily St. John Mandel and Emily Thompson.
Hey.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for doing this. I know it takes a ton of preparation. I really appreciate it.
Of course. I thought we could start off if you wanted to just kind of set the scene for us, talk a little bit about the genesis of The Glass Hotel and how you kind of followed Station 11 with a book vastly different, but also just as amazing.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, sure. So the starting point for The Glass Hotel, Something I like to emphasize in talking about this book is that every character is completely fictional, but it does revolve around a crime, which is based on Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme, which of course collapsed in New York City in December 2008. What fascinated me about that crime was partly just the scale. That was a 65 billion with a B Ponzi scheme. Like, it was just astronomical. But more than that, I was fascinated by the staff. I think this might not be widely known, but about 6 or 7 of Madoff's staffers went to prison. And at the time the story broke, I had a really great day job for a writer. I was a part-time administrative assistant in a cancer research lab, which meant that all of my coworkers were really smart, which we all know is by no means a given in any in any working environment. They were really lovely people. I really enjoyed their company. What I found myself thinking about was the camaraderie that exists in any group of people going to work together every day, that kind of sense of shared mission that you have. And then I just found myself thinking, how much weirder and more intense is that if you're all going to work on Monday to perpetuate a massive crime? I mean, that's crazy. So that was what really pulled me into the story, was imagining the lives of these office workers and how ideas around mob mentality and collective guilt might play into those lives. It's kind of a dark and fascinating subject that's been so well studied, that thing where you will do something as part of a crowd, like throw a brick through a window, that you would never dream of doing on your own. So I was kind of fascinated by that, just the group dynamics there. So, my writing process is super messy and there are a ton of revisions. But the first chapter of the book that I wrote, I think it's chapter 10 now, and like the final draft, and it's from the perspective of the office chorus. It's like a Greek chorus there. So yeah, that was the starting point, just my fascination with these people caught up in this crime.
Yeah, and I noticed you talked about the mob mentality. I noticed how you switched perspectives in that chapter to the collective first person, and clearly that was an intentional choice. And if you could just speak a little bit to that, I think you already kind of did, about how it was absolutely. The group.
Yeah. So the first line of that chapter is, "We had crossed a line." And and that goes back to that mob mentality idea, where I think it's just this weird, I don't want to say feature. Is it a glitch? I don't know. Whatever it is, this weird aspect of being human, that I think it's much easier to say we crossed a line than I crossed a line. We're kind of prone as a species to getting sort of swept up in the crowd. And, that was actually one of the things that really interested me about that crime and about that story, is that, of course, there was the other side of it, the investors, which were very intelligent people in a lot of cases, with very strong financial backgrounds, who should have known better, but allowed themselves to believe in these returns that never made sense. So it seemed to me there was just a really interesting kind of parallel mass delusion sort of happening on both sides of the crime there.
Yeah. There's the one quote by, I believe, one of the employees that's talking about it's possible to both know something and not know something. And I thought if you could speak more to that kind of the loyalty, morality, denial surrounding that, the themes, and also how it kind of plays into, you mentioned shipping, and how Leon, the character, can kind of tune in and tune out of the shipping industry, kind of how one can know something and not know something in different areas of life.
That's an interesting connection. I like that. With the shipping, I saw it in terms of the way that we view the world through the lens of our expertise, where, in your case, like, I assume you've gone from just being a reader of books to being somebody who thinks in terms of like on sale dates, pub dates, sell-through at events. You just start to look at books differently. Yeah. You don't look at a cover and think, is it pretty? You think, is it pretty and will it sell? So it's like, or like for me, reading books, the more books I write, the more I find myself kind of analyzing how the book's working. And in the same way that Leon can sort of switch that shipping mentality on and off, he can notice a beautiful handbag, or he can notice a beautiful handbag and observe that it was made in Italy and think in terms, the Northern European to, Southern European to North America route, or whatever it is. Yes, that's what I was thinking of there. The condition of knowing something and not knowing something, I think, is really interesting. And I think it's actually something that all of us are prey to a certain extent. Obviously in this book, it's pretty extreme. These are people committing a crime, and they have to tell themselves some kind of story to make that okay, to make it possible to, make eye contact with their spouse across the table at night and, fall asleep in the evening. So, that's a pretty extreme manifestation of that idea. But I kind of feel like we all do it. The example I find myself thinking of is, think of your most selfish friend. Like, we all have one. There's something a little off with that person, but you choose not to know that because you do value the friendship. So, yeah, that's just a really interesting psychological state to me.
Yeah, it's almost the like subdued intuition. Like you have that gut feeling, but you kind of subdue it to go about your daily
exactly.
life. Yeah, for sure. And you also talk about the kingdom of money, which I found really fascinating. Like how Vincent kind of jumps in to talking about like the kingdom of money that she kind of enters intentionally, but also accidentally. And then you talk about with the Hotel Caiette, like the hotel manager mentions that people want to distance themselves from nature. And I was wondering kind of how you found those two things, the kingdom of money, but then the distance from the wilderness to interact, like is one a product of the other, and also how that kind of ties in. I thought about like glamping, the new thing is like
right.
glamping, and how that kind of, that's what it reminded me of, and how you find that ties all together.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, I've never glamped, but it sounds kind of fun. Like, I'd actually like to try it. The thing with wilderness, and I grew up kind of wilderness adjacent. I'm from the coast of British Columbia, but it was remote. I'm sorry, it was rural, not remote. It was only a 10-minute ferry ride to Vancouver Island. But when I think about wilderness, it's like, on the one hand, it is so incredibly beautiful. And of course you want to see it. It's stunning. On the other hand, it's kind of annoying. Do you actually want to think about tying your food up in the trees so the bears don't get it? That kind of thing. So I certainly don't judge people who'd prefer to be wilderness adjacent, to use the phrase from the book, to look at wilderness through the window of the 5-star hotel. The kingdom of money, it does have a similar kind of remove about it, I suppose. It seems to me that how much money you have kind of determines, well, it's obvious to say that it determines what kind of experience you have in life. But it seems to me that each of those strata of experience and finance, they kind of create their own country with their own cultures and their own traditions and ways of doing things. And it's really interesting. I don't mean it in a derogatory way. I know people with quite a bit of money who I really adore. And yet every now and again, as somebody who grew up working class, I do find myself kind of bumping up against these sort of cultural traditions, I guess, for lack of a better word. And it does feel a little bit foreign to me sometimes, in a way that has nothing to do with the US-Canada border. It seems to me that for people living at a very high level of wealth, there's a kind of frictionlessness in that luxury, that kind of, I think, would make it feel like you were moving through sort of a continuous country, whether the backdrop was Singapore or London or Vancouver.
Yeah, the kind of isolation that comes with it. And you mentioned just in the book, the country of money as well as the kingdom, which is interesting for Vincent as she kind of like pops between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Vincent grows up working class, but she's a bartender at a high-end hotel, which means that she does have this ability to deal with people, who come from different levels of finance, they grew up with. So, that's a kind of cross-cultural fluency, of a kind. So, yeah, when she finds herself swept up into that kingdom of money, it does feel like the same kind of acting, I think, that she performed as a bartender. Bartending is so performative. And yeah, that definitely carries over into her life with Jonathan.
Yeah, for sure. And Vincent makes those 5-minute video clips, mostly of water. And her grandmother gives her the camera kind of as a way to like shield herself from the world. She says something along the lines of like, view it through the viewfinder if you can't look at the world directly. But it almost begs the question, like, does that connect her to the world more, or does it separate her? Because in times when she seems the most kind of, astray from herself, she grounds herself with those 5-minute videos.
Maybe it's a bit of both. Yeah, I think that photography can be a way of sort of processing the world. The idea in the book is that the lens is a shield, but that doesn't mean that it's closing you off from the world. I think sometimes photography can be a way of understanding it better.
Yeah, for sure. The different forms of art. And then we have the art scene with Olivia and young Alkaitis.
Right,
sure.
right. 13-year-old Alkaitis. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was fascinating. We get to see him young, and then we get to see him involved in the downfall of his life, pretty much.
Yeah. There's something, it's so hard to write villains, because how do you make them interesting when they're committing these horrible acts without them becoming these sort of like in old school Disney movies where you knew from the first shot who the villain was.
This one's sinister and this one's not.
Yeah, exactly. So how to humanize them. And I feel like showing the villain as a kid, which is also something I did in Station 11 with the Prophet. I think that can be effective sometimes, just for making them feel a little bit more like real people.
Yeah, for sure. And then we have Alkaitis becomes, once he's in prison, then he's then haunted, which begs the question, or kind of says, like, do you believe in ghosts, and have you ever encountered them?
I'm like Mulder from the X-Files. I want to believe, but I've never encountered a ghost myself. I do know a lot of very sane, very credible people with stories that I have no reason to doubt about the ghosts in their houses. And it's usually so banal that why would I doubt them? It's like the coffee cup moves by itself a couple of inches in the evenings, or the ornament falls off the hook when it couldn't possibly have, or something let the cat in, it was raining, like those kind of stories. So I guess if I had to come down on one side or the other, I'd say I do believe these people aren't lying. They are experiencing something. The ghost story aspect of the book, it started out being so minor. I was thinking about Jonathan, our Ponzi scheme villain in prison. I just wanted to suggest that he was becoming unanchored from reality and drifting a little bit. And I wanted there to be some ambiguity. Are we really, when you start seeing the ghosts of investors in the yard, are we really looking at ghosts? What does it mean to use the word like real, in connection with the ghost? Or are they just manifestations of guilt? So at first it was just that, but then, I don't work from an outline, which means that sometimes my books take really unexpected directions. And the more I wrote, the more I just became fascinated by that idea of, what is a ghost story? I've always loved ghost stories. I've always sought them out since I was a kid. It seems to me that when we use that phrase, ghost story, we tend to talk in kind of narrowly classical terms. Like we're talking about the sort of like translucent specter wafting down the corridor, that kind of thing. But what if your life is haunted by the ghosts of the lives you didn't lead, your counter lives? And I love that idea. Or if you think of just different ideas of what hauntedness means, none of us made it to early adulthood, in my opinion, without accumulating some catalog of regret. Even if it's just little things like that you wish you'd said or hadn't said or done or hadn't done, or moments when you were cruel as a child. So that's another kind of hauntedness, the way those moments come back to you, or being haunted by decisions that you made. Certainly in the case of Paul, Vincent's brother. So the deeper I got into this book and revising it and trying to come up with cohesive themes to pull it all together and thinking about what the book was, the more interesting it was to me to think of it as being, as being like a ghost story with different, I guess, manifestations of what that term can mean.
Yeah, it almost starts out from the beginning as a ghost story with Vincent's mother, and then goes from there. And I was also fascinated with the idea of the counter life. I thought that was a really interesting element. And do you find that also it is Alkaitis is. Jonathan, he's the one who kind of almost dissolves into his counter life. Do you find that other characters in the book also seem to kind of have a counter life?
I think we all do, to be honest. I mean, I was born and raised in Canada, and I went to school for contemporary dance. It's like, how am I a novelist in New York? That seems way less plausible than the life I could be living. So it's something I think about a lot. That there is certainly another version of my life where I stayed in Canada and kept dancing instead of turning toward writing and writing my first novel. But we all have them. It's the life where you went to a different school or married a different person or emigrated instead of staying or vice versa. And I've just always been fascinated by that idea, just all those roads not taken.
Yeah, that one decision that could change everything and we'll never know. Yeah. And Station 11, we don't want to infringe on Glass Hotel, but
I'll just kind of say I'm happy to talk about Station 11. I mean, we are in a pandemic, so it seems reasonable.
I was going to mention that, just that people, like, I read Station 11 this past summer and I was kind of drawn to it, even though it might be the time when people are divided on delving into sort of apocalyptic pandemic literature. But what do you think readers might find in Glass Hotel that relates to these kind of crazy times that we're in? Like, some may gravitate towards Station 11, but I think there's also themes that can be looked at in Glass Hotel. I was wondering what you might think readers might find in Glass Hotel in these weird year we've been having.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. If we're talking about counter lives, it's like, I don't know about you, but I find it impossible not to imagine what this last year would have been. Like the last year I thought I was going to have if the pandemic hadn't happened. There was a bad moment this summer when I got this alert from Delta Airlines saying your flight to Vancouver boards in 20 minutes. It's like, you know what? I had to cancel that flight 10 months ago. So yeah, or when you I come across calendar alerts like days when my daughter's school was going to be closed. It's like, well, it's been closed for 4 months. So we all have these kind of shadow lives that we didn't lead during this year that we spent on Crowdcast. So it's impossible not to think about.
Yeah, for sure. And I also found it interesting how you brought a few characters in to the Glass Hotel. I noticed Miranda was the first one I noticed, and also Leon. And I wonder if you were intending that to be kind of like a little sneaky factor, because for me it took a second. I was like, Miranda, I recognize that name. And then what really tied me in was the shipping. And I remember the scene from Station 11. It really stuck with me, how she's on the beach and watching the distant lights. And then it kind of all tied together for me in the Glass Hotel.
Right. I don't know if it's just a longing for order in the universe, but I do like to tie my books together in that way. And they all stand alone. You certainly don't have to read one to understand another. But I sometimes get attached to particular characters, and I just kind of want to go further with them. For Miranda in particular, she was such a big part of Station 11, but her working life was not really a big part of Station 11, even though I tried to make clear in that book that it was hugely important to her. So it's just kind of interesting to view her from a different angle in the Glass Hotel, where you only see her working life. I don't even remember if I allude to anything else about her. I was, what I tried to suggest to lay the groundwork for in Station 11 and then pick up in the Glass Hotel is the idea of parallel universes. So, if for anybody reading the Glass Hotel, the Station 11 pandemic is not coming. Like, that's not like, in the years right before this catastrophic event. I did sort of see them as parallel universes.
That's really cool. Yeah. So the Glass Hotel, it's kind of surrounding, of course, the Ponzi scheme event, but it also is interspersed with other events. There's the graffiti event, and there's even the changing of the year to the new millennium, the 2000. That's kind of not the main event, of course, but an event that's happening. And I was wondering if there's an event you've been fascinated by recently or in the past that you maybe would want to work into a book but haven't quite figured out how to fit it in. Or
right. Not off the top of my head. I was fascinated by the 2008, 2009 economic collapse, but I've gone into it in two books now. Like my third novel, The Lola Quartet, was also very much in that territory. I'm fascinated by our current situation, just by the craziness of living through a pandemic. But I actually just wrote that book. I wrote a new book during the pandemic. It's going to come out next year. So, yeah, I don't think there are any events at the moment that I'm fascinated by and haven't written about yet.
And you mentioned how, like, your books have obviously changed from the first book to now. I mean, every book changes, and just you change as a person as you're writing these books. But do you find different influences coming in, like from what you were influenced by for your first book? Does that change from what you're influenced by from your most recent?
I don't think I've changed that much since my second book, in terms of like influences. So when I wrote my first book, I'd been reading a lot of Nabokov, and I think sometimes when you're a young writer starting out, you can kind of fall into this trap where you've been given to understand that you have some degree of talent, and you kind of get all fancy and ornate. Your sentences are like super pretty and loop all over the place with a dozen subclauses. And then after I wrote Last Night in Montreal, my first novel, I read The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer. I find Mailer a little bit hit or miss as a writer, but I think The Executioner's Song is a masterpiece. And it's written in such a simple, lucid kind of way, that sort of deceptively simple thing that's really, really hard to do, but really good writers can make it look easy. And that really changed the way I wrote. So I feel like from my second novel onward, I've been going for this style that's kind of pared down, or at least it's as lucid and clear as possible and nothing too fussy or ornate. So yeah, I feel like my prose style has changed, but not really my influences, I'm in a sense that I'm still just kind of writing novels that are comedians of whatever I'm interested in at a given moment. So yeah, I've revisited container shipping in 3 books. I probably wouldn't do another one, but that's something that's kind of held my interest. When I was writing my first novel, I was fascinated by dead languages. So there's a lot of that in there. My third novel, I'd read this crazy story about the foreclosed real estate world in South Florida, and there was like a lot of that. So yeah, it's often whatever articles I've been reading that just grab my attention. That subject will make its way into whatever I'm working on.
That's the spark. Yeah. And there's a lot of interconnectedness between the characters, the narrative, all of that, in The Glass Hotel especially. Do you think the characters are aware of these connections, or they're kind of invisible to the characters?
I think they're invisible to the characters, and it's all a function of just the artifice of fiction, where something I'm always aware of when I'm writing these books, like The Glass Hotel or Station 11, where there are a lot of points of view and a lot of timelines and like there's a lot of moving parts, generally speaking. I'm always really hyper aware of just thinking, well, what can I do to make this all coherent? Like, how do I pull this whole thing together so it doesn't all fall apart? And putting in connections between characters, I think, is a good way to do that. It just sort of, I think it's satisfying for the reader. It's something that I like as a reader, personally, reading other people's works when things kind of tie together in some way.
Yeah, just like people meeting and passing, it almost ties into that idea of the counter life when our paths intersect and things like that. And you mentioned the different timelines. Like, how do you mentioned you didn't outline, but how do you keep those different timelines kind of all connected? Do you write like chronologically? Do you kind of jump around?
I jump wildly all over the place. So, as you might imagine, my first drafts are really messy. My process is I just start writing. I just kind of wing it and start writing a scene. I keep going until the scene is a chapter that starts to suggest different characters. Sometimes I'll have an idea that gives me some sense of structure. Like if I know I'm writing about a crime, for example, like the Ponzi scheme and the Glass Hotel, that does give you kind of a natural 3-act arc. There's the lead up, there's the collapse, there's the aftermath. So that gives me some direction. But yeah, after about a year or 2 years, I just have the most incredibly messy first draft. And then I spend years revising. It took 5 years to write The Glass Hotel. And I think that was mostly revision, if memory serves. I don't think it took me that long to have a beginning, middle, and end. But then, yeah, just years of flailing around trying to figure out what the book was.
Yeah. And I noticed the amazing wall of books behind you. Do you have any favorites right now? Any favorite authors?
Yeah, I've been reading this French author. I'm probably mispronouncing her name, but it's Natalie Leger. And she wrote the 3 books of hers that I've been reading. Sweet for Barbara Loden is this kind of like study of a 70s film actress. So I hadn't heard of, but it's really interesting. There's one called The White Dress, which is pretty dark. It's about a crime. And then the one I'm reading now is called Exposition. And they're these wonderful books. I'm mostly drawn to fiction. That's what I mostly read. But these are kind of novelistic nonfiction, that sort of like studies. And yeah, they're really interesting. So I've really been enjoying that lately.
Yeah. Let's see. And you've created this Hotel Caiette in your book. The Glass Hotel is Hotel Caiette. And do you find that Hotel Caiette kind of takes on as a character in and of itself, or is it kind of a combination of all the characters who, like, is it more than a setting? Is it kind of like a character in the book?
That's interesting. I see it as a kind of bubble outside of time and space. So I started writing this book while I was promoting Station 11. And, the Station 11 promotional tour was kind of epic, which, to be clear, I'm not complaining. I enjoyed it. And it's a huge privilege to get to tour as an author. But I was on the road for months. It was kind of crazy. And then after the promotional tour was over, I started doing all these paid lectures and onstage conversations all over the US and a little bit in Canada. So that's a long-winded way of saying I've stayed in a crazy number of hotels over the last 6 years or so. And at some point, I just found myself thinking, well, what would be my ideal hotel? Because often I'd be staying at, the Best Western by the highway in Texas or whatever. But sometimes I get to stay in really nice places. And it seemed to me that the really great hotels, they're kind of their own little self-contained worlds outside of time and space. And I liked the idea of putting that sort of magical world where anything's possible into a really incongruous setting, like the wilderness on northern Vancouver Island. So that was where the idea came from, just sort of imagining my ideal hotel and my ideal place. But then also I'd say, just from a technical standpoint, hotels are really useful for fiction writers. That's one of the very few environments where a lot of people from a lot of different classes and occupations can very plausibly come together. So that's where Vincent, the bartender, can meet the billionaire and, plausibly strike up a conversation with him. So yeah, hotels are useful in that way.
Yeah. And that's where the graffiti and kind of sets the tone, the broken glass. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on we've got a lot of glass symbolism and all of it, of course, the barriers that divide us, looking out, things like that. Was that always your intention? You mentioned your process. Did that kind of come together at the end to tie it together, or was it always kind of a grounding force?
It was kind of unintentional, to be honest. With the glass in the hotel, I was really just thinking of it in terms of architecture. So many hotels in that part of the world have these magnificent glass curtain walls because the surroundings are so gorgeous. You don't want to look at the hotel. You want to be wilderness adjacent. You want to see the trees and mountains and the water. So it seemed to me a great hotel there, would have this glass component. And then the graffiti message, this will sound kind of crazy, and it was kind of crazy, but A million years ago on Twitter, somebody told me to kill myself with a very similar message. Twitter is crazy. And so that made me think a lot about the sort of unintended consequences of messaging. Because what I found myself thinking of around that time was, what if somebody had seen this who was in a really fragile state? Like it's devastating to think about. So the message that's written on the glass, why don't you swallow broken glass? It's just a very slight change from the message that was written to me on Twitter. It was pretty crazy. So yeah, that came off social media. The other glass in the book, I think you are onto something in terms of sort of looking through, being at a distance, I guess, having something between you and the other party. And, as I say that, it makes me think of your earlier question about the camera lens as a shield. It's a very similar dynamic.
Yeah, the thin veil of separation, but also the public eye. I noticed with Glass Hotel and Vincent kind of playing this part in the public eye, being the wife with not really being the wife in this tricky arrangement. And you talked about in Station 11 also there's the celebrities and the paparazzi. What kind of draws you to that angle, the kind of, I don't know, like celebrity wife almost, or like the money, but being in it, but being separate from it?
Right. With Station 11 and the paparazzi scenes, I would say I'm just kind of interested in celebrity culture as a phenomenon. I saw the Amy Winehouse documentary a number of years ago, which I really recommend if anybody hasn't seen it. There's this terrible scene from close to the end of her life. She was quite fragile. And there's a scene where she's just trying to walk down the street. She's this kind of hunched over figure with her hands in her trench coat pockets. Men are jumping out from behind cars, taking pictures, and the volume is so intense, like the number of pictures being taken, that it's like strobe lighting. It's just flash after flash after flash after flash. And there's something so dark in that. You see that footage and you think that's somebody who's being hunted. Like that's really kind of insanely awful. And it seems to me that we sort of absorb celebrity news or like gossip kind of in the same way that my grandmother followed her soap operas. I think we sort of forget that these are actually real people. So yeah, that was just a phenomenon that I found really interesting. And then with Vincent, I was thinking of it very much as a performance, which, that's a topic that interests me too. The way that we do perform in our daily lives, the way that you're a different person with your colleagues than you are with your family. And I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with that, but it is interesting, to just kind of take that to an extreme where, Vincent's performing this role to the best of her ability. And it's gone so far, like it's kind of her job.
Yeah. And she kind of wants to put it all behind her after the collapse. Yeah. And with the mention of Vincent, it is said in the book also that it's a uncommon name for a woman. And did you have any, like, what went into factoring? I mean, naming any of your characters really, but Vincent specifically.
It's partly just that I love the name. I actually thought about naming my daughter Vincent. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I just kind of lost my nerve. I was like, is that terribly hipster to give her the name Vincent? Like it could go either way, but it did feel like a failure of nerve. It's a beautiful name. More importantly, though, around the time I started writing this book, I'd recently read a book called Savage Beauty, which is a fantastic biography of the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, who went by Vincent all her life. Something I admire about her, which seemed applicable to my character, Vincent, is she's somebody who catapulted herself from one life into another by sheer force of will. And I love that. That's something I really respect as a trait. The Vincent in the book does it very differently than Edna St. Vincent Millay did, but it's kind of the same principle, the force of will that propels you. So it seemed like a good name for that character.
Yeah, it really stuck in my head. I don't know, the Vincent name. Hi.
I just was looking at the time and looking at the amount of questions that we have, and that seemed like kind of a good spot to maybe maybe take some of the audience questions if you are willing, author Emily.
I'd be delighted.
Okay, well, I have so enjoyed this conversation between the two of you. It's been really fascinating, and you have actually answered quite a few of the questions that have been placed in the Ask a Question feature. But someone wants to know. I don't know their name, so I can't acknowledge who they are. But they want to know if you have ever written or if you are drawn to poetry.
I've written terrible poetry, which I'm sure a lot of us have. I'm really drawn to prose poetry, but I feel kind of intimidated by the form, if we're being totally honest. It doesn't really draw me in as a reader. Like, I feel like I have to make an effort to read poetry. So I don't know. I'm sure I could develop that muscle as a reader, but I don't feel like a natural poet as a writer.
I kind of feel the same way. I feel like not that the person was interested in wanting to know if I read poetry, but it's the same thing. It's a muscle that I don't use.
Yeah.
So it's underdeveloped. What was? Let's see. Who is this? Oh, I don't know people's names. I'm sorry. I would acknowledge the people with their names, but I don't see them. What was the first storyline element that came to you for the Glass Hotel? I think you might have addressed that a little bit, but what was the thing that sparked the Glass Hotel?
It was that group of staffers in that crazy office. I remember sitting down and writing that chapter, obviously in a much rougher form. I revise everything, but yeah, I think it begins we'd crossed a line. That much was obvious, but later we didn't know exactly where that line had been, because it seemed to me that it's kind of creepily easy to cross that line. Like, I feel like we're probably, for the most part, not quite as morally unimpeachable as you'd like to imagine. So yeah, it was just really interesting to me to imagine how a person might kind of drift gradually and then suddenly into this kind of territory of criminality.
I was fascinated by that notion of just the two floors. It was just separated by, the 18th floor and the 17th floor. The 18th floor, separated by a staircase, but totally different things and awarenesses going on each floor. And then when it all starts to unravel, the things happening on each floor, it was very, very compelling for
Thank
sure.
you.
And heart racing.
Good.
So yeah. Someone mentioned in the questions a connection to Cloud Atlas.
Yeah.
Is there some sort of connection to Cloud Atlas, or?
There is, yeah. That person might have seen a previous event or an interview where I talked about it. So Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, it's one of my very favorite novels. And I'm particularly fascinated by the structure of it, which I'll just lay out for anybody who hasn't had the fortune of reading the book, in which case I envy you because you get to read it for the first time. It's laid out in this perfectly symmetrical way. So you could map it as like A, B, C, D, C, B, A, where each letter represents a different perspective at a different point in time. And it's just really an interesting book. So I tried to use that structure for the Glass Hotel. It absolutely did not work. It turns out that it's really hard to maintain narrative tension in a novel if you're committed by your structure to returning to exactly the same point in time in exactly the same order. So yeah, I just couldn't make it work. So I had to abandon it. But I think that some shadow of that structural idea does remain. And that the book does begin and end at exactly the same moment, with Vincent falling off the ship. And then the second chapter and the second to last chapter concern Vincent's brother, Paul. So yeah, it's kind of like the echo of that symmetry in there. But I wasn't able to sustain it for the entire book.
Yeah. Another person wants to know you thought a lot about the Ponzi scheme and were influenced by what happened with Bernie Madoff. What about Enron? The Enron meltdown, did that?
Yeah, I mean, it was on my radar. That was an interesting story. I guess it just didn't grab me to the extent that the Madoff story did.
Okay. Say when you mentioned that you are jealous that you can't read Cloud Atlas for the first time again. Actually, one of my favorite questions to ask an author is, if you could reread any book from your lifetime for the first time again, what would it be? So would Cloud Atlas be your answer, or would it be a different book?
It might be Cloud Atlas, but actually, as you were asking the question, the book I was thinking of was Sweet Française by Irene Nemirovsky, which it's just an incredible book. It might be a toss-up between those two.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing to think about. There are lots of books where I feel envious when people say that they haven't read them and they're going to read them, and I'm like, oh, I want to read that for the first time again.
I know. It should be possible to do this very localized memory wipe, so you can just like
right.
Yeah.
Abby is asking, and I'm sure that many people in the audience would like to know, can you give us any kind of hint at all about what the new book is about?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it, but maybe just don't tell Twitter, because there's like supposed to be some announcement or something.
I gotta say, I'm appalled that you received a message like that on Twitter, and I'm really sorry about that. And that's horrifying to me, and I'm really sorry.
Yeah, it was insane. There are crazy people out there, and they're all on Twitter. So I avoid it now for the most part.
Very good. Very good.
The new book is called Sea of Tranquility. And it's kind of crazy because I mostly wrote it in quarantine. So it moves, actually, it kind of has the same Cloud Atlas structure, except I had to break it up a little bit because, again, that structure is super hard. It moves forward and back in time from Vancouver Island in 1912 all the way up to life on moon colonies in the year 2400. And there's a time traveler. And it's a really crazy book that I'm not quite sure how to describe, but I think there'll be an announcement soon, and it'll come out in spring of next year, so about a year from now.
Okay. Oh, something to look forward to. And I love time travel elements.
Yeah,
fun. So Emily T, I don't know if you've been thinking about your answer to that question of what book would you reread for the first time?
I haven't. I think there's one of my favorites authors is Frederick Backman, and his book A Man Called, I always say but I think it's that one really, and that was his first one, and I read it, and now I've read all of his, but that would probably be one of mine.
It's a great book. So author Emily, can you tell us
there's so many Emilys in the world, aren't there?
The top baby name of the year I was born.
Yeah, same.
Nice. Okay, so we were hoping, or I think maybe Caitlin is as the person in the audience who was asking this, but I am also curious about this. Can you talk a little bit about Vincent's mom? She says, we were having a debate in my book group about if Vincent's mom's death was supposed to mirror something that would happen to Vincent, or if it was, if you could just speak to that.
I would put it, you know what I'm struggling with is how to talk about this without spoiling the ending. So maybe I'll just talk a little more generally about Vincent's mom in an extremely unsatisfying way, with apologies to the person who asked the question. There's the reality of living in the wilderness, and then there's the ideal of being a poet in the wilderness. And she's somebody who just kind of crashes up against that in kind of a tragic way.
Okay.
I'm sorry, that in no way answered the question, but what can you do?
Well, I'm wondering, let's see. When you were writing this, you were yourself a new mother? So did you think at all about your relationship with your child? I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. No, I didn't think of my relationship with my child, but having a child, like, it does give you an understanding you would never otherwise have of just the relentlessness of early parenthood. And mapping that relentlessness onto life in a very remote place, and like, oh my god, like it's not easy in Brooklyn, like in one of the nicest neighborhoods that I've ever lived in. Trying to imagine it in a kind of place where like you need to remember to buy gas for your generator because you're off the grid, and the deer keep eating your organic vegetables. Like it's just a whole other level of difficulty and toil and insanity. Yeah, so I was thinking of that, just how much harder this would be in an environment like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't imagine being a young mother or having little ones kind of in the wild like that.
Yeah. It would be hard.
It's already so hard. So I understand there's a Station 11. Is there a TV series?
Yeah, it's a TV series. I'm not I'm not officially involved with it, but I'm friends with the showrunner, which is the showrunner is what it sounds like. That's the guy who's running the show, and he's also the head writer on the project. So you know, I get text updates every now and again. It's actually filming right now in Toronto. And this is kind of funny. It's so meta. Okay, so the showrunner told me that he wanted to move the location from Toronto to Chicago, which I'm fine with, of dual citizenship. So they filmed the first 2 episodes in Chicago at the beginning of last year. And then I bet everybody can guess how the story is going to go. The pandemic came, production was shut down. Everybody went their separate ways and worked on post-production and wrote new episodes. Statistically, Canada is much safer than the United States because they've just done a vastly better job with public health up there. So a lot of productions are moving to Canada because you have a much lower chance of being shut down with a COVID outbreak. So Station 11 just moved to Canada, but now Canada's playing the role of Chicago, which was, and Canada was the original location of the book. So yeah, it's very circular. But
that's interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, it's filming now outside of Toronto.
And what does that feel like to sort of turn this over and have other people kind of take it and run with it? Does it? Are you fine with it? Like, have fun.
Yeah, I'm fine with it.
Okay.
I kind of feel like there are 2 ways you can go with this stuff. Like you can either maintain really tight control and be really involved, or you can say, sure, give me a check and go do your thing. So that was kind of where I fell with Station 11. I was, by the time that TV project became real, I was so deeply into the Glass Hotel, and it was more interesting to me to stay with that. I feel it's this weird combination of detachment and excitement where, I feel like once you sell those rights, they're sold, so they can do whatever they want with it. I also really care whether it's good, and I think it will be. I think it's in really good hands. So, good. I'm just really excited to see what it looks like. I spent so much time imagining the world of that book, and I think it'll be really thrilling to see the traveling caravans.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, I think there are a lot of people who are very excited, highly anticipated. So, I think that is. I think just about everything has been covered without, just really
spoiling the ending.
Exactly. Talking about, I don't want to, we want to leave things for people to learn themselves when they read the book for the first time, if they haven't read it. And now actually, when I go back and reread it, things I'm going to notice and go, oh, that's what she was talking about. So, so I really want to thank both of you so much for your conversation. Thank you, Emily, author Emily, for being here, and thank you, Emily T, for for coming up with such great, thoughtful questions. And I want to, of course, thank the audience as well for coming. There's a lot of love in the chat, lots and lots of positive.
Really nice.
From people from all over. So. We are so grateful that you were here with us this evening. Are there any final thoughts that you would like to share with everybody?
I just really appreciate everybody being here and reading my work and supporting your independent bookstores during what's been a pretty tough year. So yeah, thank you. That's what I really want to say.
All right. Well, I think with that, we get to say goodnight, and it's late where you are, so maybe now you get to go to bed.
Night. Yeah. A bit of a lightweight these days, I'm afraid.
Understood. All right. Well, thank you so much. And with that, I think we'll say goodnight.
All right. Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good